And we are live. Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm glad to see such a full room of people. I love being able to deliver this presentation to people. This is stuff that I want people to know. So thank you for coming. Let us get started with our presentation. This is OOP, Design Patterns, and Drupal 8. So I'm Marc Isaacson. You can find me online as Vegan Triathlete. I'm a Drupal freelancer, and you can find me on Drupal.org at Vegan Triathlete. You can also find me on GitHub.com at Vegan Triathlete. You can find my company site at isaacsonwebdevelopment.com. I've been doing this since 2010, and I'm still doing it because I love doing web development, I love open source, I love Drupal, and I love Drupal even more now that Drupal 8 has come out. So I'm so excited with what's happened with Drupal 8. And how I do it is that I'm a code monkey. I'm a back-end guy, total server-side guy, okay? So that's how I do my thing. That's how I earn my money. And that's the type of stuff that I love to do. But enough about me. What about you? So who is this presentation targeted towards? This is geared towards people who are beginner Drupal 8 developers. And by beginner, I mean even if you've never done Drupal at all before, that's totally fine. I don't make any assumptions about your knowledge of Drupal. I'm covering fundamentals in here, and so it should be understandable for anybody in the room, whatever your skill level is. What you should be expecting to get out of this presentation here is that you're going to get a handle at a high level of how you go about doing. This is geared towards module development in Drupal. So how you do development in Drupal, that's what you should be expecting out of this presentation. And I'm telling you, when you want to start learning this is as soon as possible. And you're going to get a chance to start doing that in the presentation. And why you want to be learning this as soon as possible is that whether you're experienced with Drupal 8, whether you're experienced with Drupal, or you have no experience with it whatsoever, if you're somebody who's been doing Drupal for a while and you've maybe kind of had it up to here and you're like, ugh, Drupal 8 is a good thing for you to learn, because when you're learning Drupal 8, you're learning much more than just Drupalisms at this point. You're learning modern web development best practices. So whether you've used Drupal before, you haven't used Drupal before, whether you've done web development before or you haven't, learning Drupal 8 is a really good investment, because not only are you making yourself marketable as a Drupal developer at that point, you're making yourself more marketable as a web developer in general, because you're going to be learning about modern web development best practices at this point. You're going to be able to understand how to do things where you can talk to people in a way that it's not just Drupalisms anymore. Like when I would talk with fellow web developer friends before, prior to Drupal 8, and I would mention things like when you talk to them about like hook form alter, it's like, what are you talking about? But now I can talk to my friends about like dependency injection, like, oh yeah, and service containers and stuff like that. So you're able to hold on a conversation with people who are outside the Drupal community. You're able to hold on conversations with prospective employers who maybe don't do Drupal, because you've actually developed some skills now that are used in other web development. So that's why you want to be learning this stuff. And how you're going to do it is we are going to look at code here. There will be code in this presentation. As I mentioned, I'm a code monkey. I'm a back-end guy. So what types of things are we going to be looking at? We're going to be going over a pretty quick and high-level look, brief introduction to the things that you need to know in order to be able to start doing module development in Drupal 8. What we are not going to be doing is looking at all of the possible edge cases. And what if I've got this crazy type of scenario for this enterprise client who's got to do this, edge side includes, and this. All right, we're not getting into all that kind of crazy detail. This is the stuff that you're pretty much going to need to do on every project that you do when you need to do some module development. So having set that up, this is where I now give you the opportunity to decide if that sounds good to you, if that's what you came here for, you're excited to listen to the rest of the presentation, and you're willing to play along with my rules. And if you're not, this would be a fabulous time. We're only 6 minutes into this and you decide that you want to see another presentation. I promise I won't be too offended if you decide to get up and walk out and go someplace else. But if you remain seated, you've agreed to the terms and conditions of this presentation. And as we get into it, you have to understand that if you're starting to get into these nitty-gritty type of comments and arguments about things, I'm going to say, that wasn't part of the ground rules. You aren't playing by the rules. So having done that, nobody's gotten up and left. We're going to roll into the first real part of the presentation. It's called OOP, Design Patterns, and Drupal 8. So as far as OOP, even with having approximately an hour to talk to you, you're not going to be a master of all things object-oriented programming before, by the time you leave here. I'm going to look specifically at things like what are interfaces, what are classes and abstract classes, why would you use a trait, what's dependency injection, what are services. This presentation isn't really so much Drupal as it is going to be object-oriented types of concepts. What I'm not going to get into is, this is the exact way you're supposed to do OOP. All of the really smart people do it exactly like this, and if you do it any differently, then you're an absolute moron and you don't get to call yourself a web developer. We're not getting into all those flame wars and debates about, this is absolutely the way it must be done. So again, understand the expectation that I'm going to show you certain things. Perhaps somebody else would say, well, I would do that slightly different. That's okay. We're focusing more on these general concepts. As far as design patterns, the types of design patterns that I'm going to talk about have to do with the things that Drupal uses the patterns over and over again in Drupal 8. So they use YAML files, they've got services, they've got plugins, they use the service container. The things that I'm not talking about when I'm saying the design patterns is if you're familiar with the Gang of Four. And so while Drupal is using things like factories or adapters or decorators, they may be doing some of that type of stuff. I'm not going to be using those terms here. The design patterns are the Drupal-specific type of design patterns. Like, oh, you're going to see this over and over again in the code. What I'm going to talk about in Drupal 8 is specific code examples of how we're going to get up running. If you want to write a module, here are the things that you need to do. But we're not going to get into here's all about users, roles, and permissions, all the site building stuff, and here's how you do views, and here's how multilingual was done in Drupal 8. This is geared at the code level. And so speaking of code examples and digging into the code, there is a module that's running this presentation, and it's on my GitHub repository here, Vegan Triathlete /presentation. It is my intention that ultimately this will be a contributed module to Drupal. I wrote a module to be able to do presentations in Drupal 8, and then we've got an actual bit of functioning code that we can look at, so these aren't hypothetical problem cases we've come up with. This is stuff that I actually had to do to make this module work for this presentation that I'm giving right now, and you can find it right there in that GitHub repository. As well as you can actually get this presentation in the repository as well. Go to my GitHub account and look for the OOP-DP-D8. And you can grab, there's the database, there's all of the code, pull it down, you can run this presentation locally on your own machine. So that you don't have to worry about taking a ton of notes while you're doing this. You've got places that you can go to later on to get at all of that material. So please, go ahead, check those things out, grab those resources. So as far as this module that's running the presentation, every module and every theme needs a .info file. That's the way it is right now. So naturally, I've got one of those. I did write services, so I've got a services YAML file. I've got a controller that displays things, and so I need a route to be able to define the path for that controller. I do have a libraries YAML file because I've got a very small library asset that I needed to maintain in here. And I actually ended up needing a .module file as well. So we're going to get a chance to see all of those things. Where those things reside is in the root level of that module. So there you see the info, the libraries, the .module, the routing, and the services file. There's a new structure that you use when you're doing things in Drupal 8, and it ties into the ability to be able to do this auto-loading and lazy loading of assets. And so certain things go in certain places. Fortunately, it's very consistent, and this is one of those patterns that you're going to learn about. It's like, oh, I want to do this thing, this goes in that place. You know where to find these various things. So all of these files that I mentioned are actually at the root level of your module structure. Okay, so let's talk about services now. This is a big change, the way that things are being done now, and the way that you should be thinking when you're writing modules in Drupal 8 is you're going to be building a lot of services. And a service is a collection of useful functionality that can be used across an application. And one way you can think of a service is in terms of almost like, let me pretend that I'm writing this third-party library that can get plugged into other applications. And so I want to put this logic into this service so that it can be useful, not just in my application, but in other applications as well. And so I've made heavy use of services to do this presentation. And you've already seen it in action. As I'm going through my slides, you've seen there's a link that would take me to the previous slide. You see there's a link that takes me to the next slide. These are blocks that I place into the regions there, and they're configurable blocks to say, is this supposed to be the previous block, or is this supposed to be the next block? But that block makes use of a service to actually get that link back. The block says, oh, give me the next, show me what the next slide is. Give me the link for the next slide. Give me the link for the previous slide. On the very first page when you came in, that table of contents is a controller to create that page, but that controller is making use of a service that generates the table of contents for it. If you look at the presentation module and you look at my logic that's inside of my block, if you look at the logic that's inside of my controller, it's very thin, it's very teeny tiny. You put your business logic inside of services so that everything else can stay really clean and thin, and not all these hundreds or thousands of lines of code. So that table of contents is generated through a service. How do we do services? Well, we have a class. We're going to create an object. It's an object that has certain methods on it. Those methods are what are utilized by other things in your system. So I've got my presentation manager service, which implements my presentation manager service interface. We'll get to interfaces in a little bit. Let's look more at the service itself. I've told you functionality that it's providing. There's the create table of contents method. So when other things, because I've also got the ability to place a block that displays the table of contents. So they use the same method. I haven't placed the block in my particular presentation because I just didn't need it here. But you can think in terms of if somebody had a general site and they might have wanted to have a presentation embedded someplace in the site, then they might have wanted to have this block that they place someplace that shows, oh, here's what you can get in the presentation. So that's one of my methods I've got. Create the table of contents for me. I've got the method for getting the previous slide and the method for getting the next slide. Tell me what the link is tell me what the node is that's going to give me my previous and next slides. And then finally, I've got this method for getting the slide images. There's the block that I've placed here that's got these thumbnails. It has a slide image that opens up in a modal. So I've got the method that tells me what slide images are associated with the node that I'm looking at right now. That block needs to know what slide images are supposed to be placed inside of it. So let's look at the interface then, because I mentioned how I created the service, it's a class that implements an interface. And so you might ask, well, what's an interface? And I know that wherefore actually means why and doesn't mean what, but wherefore art thou interface sounds way cooler than saying what is an interface. So wherefore art thou interface? So what is an interface? An interface is essentially like a blueprint or a contract. It sets out the expectations of what you have available to you when you have an object, a class, that implements that interface. Additionally, interfaces are really the magic that make dependency injection work. That's not technically true. Dependency injection doesn't actually depend on the fact that there are interfaces, but for it to actually be really useful, you really need to have interfaces, because you type hint with an interface instead of type hinting with a specific class on the object that's being injected. And if you type hinted with a class, the problem you run into when you're injecting those dependencies is you can only inject instantiations of that specific class. Well, you lose a lot of functionality that way, because what if you don't like the way that class was written and you would rather substitute your own implementation of that logic? You have to hack that class. But when you type it with interfaces, you can inject any object that implements that interface. So it makes things much more swappable, which makes dependency injection that much more useful. Okay, so how do we define interfaces and what do interfaces look like? Instead of using the class keyword, we use the interface keyword. So I've defined my interface. It's called the Presentation Manager Service Interface. And then what do I put inside of that interface? Because you got to peek at what I put inside of the class. The interface is mostly comments. It's mostly dot block. And then you get your signature of, here's the method that I expected you're going to have. So you can see there's not even any curly braces. You put no logic at all inside an interface. It's basically documentation. It's a contract and it's documentation. And one of the nice things about an interface, speaking of documentation, is that this is something that a non-technical person could pretty easily read and understand. Oh, this is what the application is supposed to be doing. This is what's available to me. They don't have to go through hundreds or thousands of lines of code. An interface is not something so scary to think about opening up and looking at, because it's mostly comments, just English language that's explaining what's happening. So you can see any class that's going to implement this interface has to provide the create table of contents method. It has to provide the get previous slide method. It has to provide the get next slide method, and it has to provide the get slide images method. When you implement an interface, you must provide implementations of every one of the methods in there. That's the contract. Now, you'll notice what I'm having to do in this presentation. I have to keep escaping out of this and then going into the next slide. One of the things that would be nice for me to do before I would make this a contributed module would be to have another method, actually two more methods, get next image and get previous image. So this would be sort of more like when you use color blocks or those type of tools where you've got your gallery, and I could actually just be in here and go to the next image, go to the previous image. So whenever I would happen to have the free time to do that, I would come into my interface and I would add these two methods that say get next image, get previous image. And that would be part of the contract. And anybody who implements my interface would then have to do those methods as well. Maybe say somebody looked at my service and said, this guy's an idiot. He doesn't have any idea how to code. I could write this in a much better fashion. As long as they're doing implementing my interface, they're going to also then have to make sure that they do those two methods that I would put in there. So that's what our interface looks like. Let's come back to classes. I'm using a lot of terms now about object-oriented programming. And I've used the word class, I've used this idea of instantiation, and I'm saying these types of words here. So classes is that's where you bundle your, you can bundle attributes, which we call properties. You can bundle functionality, which are called methods. Question?
Yes.
Yeah.
In the interface, where are the code of the methods actually written?
So you implement the interface inside of a class. The interface never has any logic in it. you put the logic inside of the class that implements that interface.
And the interface just calls the methods of the class.
The interface doesn't actually call the methods. The interface, think of it in terms of literally like it's a contract that you're signing. So you can think of it as though when you are going to write this class that implements that interface, you've now signed this contract and said, I agree to do this. What PHP will do, though, is when it's going to compile your class, turn it, I'm not talking about you instantiating an object. I'm talking like the PHP interpreter when it's going to compile that file so that it's actually something that's executable. It will check that since you've said you implement an interface, it will refer to the interface and it will let you know if you haven't implemented all the methods, if you've changed the type of something, like it'll make sure that you are agreeing to that contract. But basically what an interface is you just think of it as sort of like it's a text file and it's a contract that's been written by a developer for any other developers that are going to implement that interface. All of the logic goes inside an actual class. Okay? All right. So classes is where we've got these properties, we've got these functions, and then we instantiate a class into an object. PHP is a single inheritance language. And the way that you inherit from other classes is by extending that class. But you can't extend more than one class. Okay? So let's look at what I'm talking about here, an example of this. What do we do with classes? How do classes come into play with object-oriented programming? I've got a controller that's responsible for creating this image that you see inside of the modal. Since I'm creating a controller, I am extending the controller base. Controller base is a class that Drupal 8 provides. This isn't something that PHP provides or is just everywhere in OOP. This is a class that Drupal has provided. It's the controller base class. When I extend that class, that means I've got access to whatever methods and whatever property are inside of that class. And I can use them as is. They're available to my class. This is the notion of inheritance within object-oriented programming, not just within PHP. The difference with PHP is that you can only extend one class, which means it's single inheritance. So this is how classes work, and this is what you do when you're doing object-oriented programming. The idea of a class is that this is, you think in terms of, here's an object, and here's like if you had a deck of cards. You would expect certain properties about what suit is this card, what number is this card. You would expect the deck of cards to be able to shuffle itself, for instance. So properties that you would have would be like suit and, I forget what you call it, like the value, like, ace through king or whatever. Those would be properties that you would have, and then a method that you might have with the deck of cards would be shuffle. So that you package objects up into classes. This is what object-oriented programming is. You inherit by extending another class. And that's what we've got here. You do it with the extends statement in PHP. So there's classes for you. So why would we have abstract classes then? So what we've seen right now is we've seen classes. I have a service that I defined as a class, which in that data actually didn't extend to any other class, that didn't inherit anything. I built it all on its own. I've got this controller that I showed you, which is a class that extends another class, so it inherits things from that. And I've shown you the interface that I had defined for my service that I had written. So why would we have abstract classes then? Why do we need yet something else? Why not just classes and interfaces? Why abstract classes? Well, there are some limitations that you have to understand about abstract classes. Before I tell you why we're going to actually use them, I'm going to tell you what they don't do for you. The difference between a class and an abstract class is that you can't actually instantiate an abstract class. You need to extend it with a concrete class, and that concrete class is what ends up getting instantiated. So abstract classes are more limited than classes because abstract classes can't actually be instantiated. And they also still don't give the ability to it doesn't provide you multiple inheritance. You can still only extend a single abstract class. So there's limitations of what you can or can't do with an abstract class. We're going to look at an example, and we're going to stop being so abstract about it in a moment. But I didn't actually have to write an abstract class for my presentation module. So we don't have one that we can look at within my module. What we're going to do is we're going to look at examples from Drupal core where they're using an abstract class. And what we're going to see is this. An abstract class is sort of a middle ground between an interface and a concrete class. So it sort of has some things that are like an interface, and it has some things that are also like a class. But you don't instantiate an abstract class, but you can put code into an abstract class. So it's more than an interface, but less than an actual full-blown class. Let's see examples now. This is from Drupal core, and I don't expect you to memorize everything that's here. I'm going to tell you what to focus on in these slides. We're going to look at the list item base abstract class. This abstract class also happens to extend another class and implement a particular interface. You can implement as many interfaces as you want, by the way. Implementing an interface just means that you're going to guarantee that there are certain properties and there are certain methods that are available inside of your class. It doesn't matter whether the class that's being extended by this is an abstract class or an actual concrete class. It extends this class, it implements the interface. Just focus on the list item base abstract class. And let's look at some of the things that are inside of that abstract class. These first few methods that we're looking at, default, storage settings, get possible values, get possible options, you can see these are methods that have logic defined in them. And in fact, we are going to inherit these methods, or Drupal 8 inherits these methods directly into the classes that extend this abstract class. They just take them as is and they use them. So there's where an abstract class is more powerful than an interface, is that you can actually put some logic in it that can be inherited by other classes that extend it. Take it, use it, you're good to go. You don't have to do anything else. So these are going to be used straight up as is. Okay? Other types of methods that you can see inside an abstract class is you may actually see something, and this is why you need an abstract class as opposed to just doing things with classes. An abstract class allows you to define an abstract method. And you can see this looks very much like what you get in an interface. This one doesn't have the curly braces around it. So what this is saying is that when you extend this abstract class, you must provide a concrete implementation of this method. I have no idea what description you want to associate with the allowed values that you have. I can't even begin to put something in here, so I'm going to make it an abstract method, and now you are responsible for creating that concrete method in here. The first thing we looked at is where the abstract class is kind of like a regular class. This is where an abstract class is kind of like an interface. And that's this whole abstract method is what defined the need for having an abstract class. Okay? You don't have abstract classes in abstract methods in a concrete class. So this is like an interface. We're going to see that this must be implemented. And then the third type of method that you're going to see in there is that this one actually has some logic in it. And what you can do when you inherit from another class is you can completely override it if you want to override a method, or you could use that method and then extend it a little bit. In this case, what we're going to see in Drupal is that this is called cast allowed values, the method, and you're going to notice that it gets a value and it just returns the value. So this isn't really doing much of anything right now. It's not being cast as anything. And you're going to see what ends up happening in the concrete implementation that extends this abstract class is that they actually cast this value as something before they return it. So let's look at those things. Those first three methods I can't show you because they're just used straight up. You don't even see them in your class that's extending the abstract class. So what we will look at is now where we've got this list string item that's extending our list item base. And remember, the list item base is our abstract class. This time we're saying we're using, this is actually a list string type of item that's going to extend our generic list item base. And now we're going to get to see those other methods. Not the first few that I showed you, because those are inherited directly and they're used. But what we will see is, here's our allowed values description, which we now have our concrete implementation of that. It's no longer an abstract method, it's an actual method that we've written. And there's where we've got our allowed values description, and we put logic in there. So that's where we've now made our implementation of the abstract method into a concrete method. And then the third one that we had looked at is where we had the cast allowed value, and here's where we've taken it, and now this one is totally overridden that function because there's only the one line in it, but there are ways that we could have actually taken the stuff that the original function did and then extended that. And we will see an example of that later on in the presentation. So those are the three types of things, methods, that you're going to see inside of an abstract class. And now we've seen classes, interfaces, and abstract classes. And we are going to move on to the next idea. Traits. Traits is one of those things in the PHP community that has a bit of debate and contention around it. This is one of those things where you could get into the flame wars, but we're not getting into flame wars in this presentation. We are looking at traits because I think you will find in the PHP community that there's at least a consensus that they can provide some useful functionality. And the useful functionality they provide is a workaround to the fact that PHP is single inheritance. I've got a block that needs to return a table of contents in this module, and I've got a controller that needs to return a table of contents. It's basically the same method. It's defining a render array. But I can't extend the block base and extend the controller base. But if I put this logic inside of the controller base, then it's not available to the block. And if I try doing it the other way, then it's not. So what do I do about it? I can't extend both things. This is where traits come in. They give us a way to get around the fact that PHP is single inheritance. You put this code inside of a trait, and then you can use that trait wherever you want to use it. It provides you code reuse, so you don't have to repeat yourself. Let's have a look at a specific. I have these two different places where I can create a table of contents. So I created a trait that I called the table of contents trait. And you use the trait keyword. Interface, class, abstract class, trait. These are all keywords that you use when you're defining your things in PHP. That table of contents trait has a method that's called build. This is what's generating a render array for us that's going to have a table of contents in it. I can name the trait whatever I want to name it. I can name the method whatever I want to name it. It's possible when you use a trait, you can alias the name of the trait. You can also alias any of its methods. And sometimes this becomes necessary. If you look in Drupal core, you're going to see where there's certain traits that have been aliased because they would have had they had another trait that was named the same way, so they needed to be able to, or they needed to use the trait more than one time. But you can alias the name of the trait. You can alias the name of the method. I've named my method build because the block base expects that you're going to provide a build method, and my block is using this trait, and so now it's got the build method. In my controller, I can name the method whatever I want. That's going to return the display for that page. But build is as good as any other thing. However, if for some reason I felt like in my controller I needed to have that method named something else, I could alias it and I could use it as something else. This is perfectly acceptable, and I end up using this as is. That's the contents of my trait. There's a build method in it. It generates a render array. That render array is what gets returned, and that's what's displayed. How do I use it? Very simply, you put inside your class, use this trait. Now, what you're going to do is, in your use statements that are outside of the class, those are different from the use statements inside of the class. The use statements outside of the class has to deal with namespacing in PHP. And so you don't have to do the fully qualified name of the trait. If you do a use statement outside of it, then for any of the objects that you're using, not just the traits, then you can refer to it. So there is, if you look at my code, you'll see there's a use statement in this class that says what namespace this trait is in. But to use it, you just, inside your class, you say use that trait. And what this is pretty much the same thing as whether you do an include or an include once or a require once. It's pretty much the exact same thing as you do in procedural code. It's going to drop that bit of code that was inside of the trait right into that spot. You can place it wherever you want to place it in your class. It doesn't have to be at the top of the class. You could put it at the end of the class if you wanted, wherever you think it's most suitable. You just use it. And what ends up happening when the PHP interpreter is going to compile your file into an executable object, it pretty much just copies and pastes that code right into place there, and now it gets interpreted and it gets compiled into an object. That's all that traits are. They're pretty simple to use, and they're pretty handy to help you with this issue of, I really want this in two different places, but I can't put it into a trait. So that's how you use it. Okay. Now let's look at some of the things that some of you may have noticed. You've seen a lot of doc blocks that I've had. You've seen a lot of code examples, and you might have noticed in some of my doc blocks, there was these weird kind of comments at the top that has like this @ sign in front of it, and then there's some other stuff. There's indentation, and there's curly braces. It's like, this is some of the weirdest documentation I've ever seen. Like, what is going on there? Those funny comments actually aren't comments. They're called annotations. And they're actually code. They're more like code than they are comments. They provide functionality. They can make changes to configuration. They can provide functionality to your class that you're writing. Drupal uses annotations very heavily with its whole plugin system. Plugins are so tied into this notion of annotations. Let's look at an example of a particular type of plugin annotation. What type of annotation do you think this is right here? It's not a trick question. Somebody said it. It's a block annotation. I'm going to write a block plugin. You use a block annotation. The block annotation, you use the ID key. This provides your machine name for the block. The admin label and the category is what you see when you go into the block layout. Like if you're going to go place a block and then you see that modal that comes up, it gets the information about there's two columns. And so one is like, what's the name of your block, the human readable name, and then what category is this part of? That's provided through the annotation. And that's cool. I mean, that's fine. And we need to have the machine name. But what's super cool about this annotation is this key right here, this context key. Using that key in my block annotation makes my block a context-aware plugin. I don't have to extend any particular class. I don't have to implement any particular phase. But because I've said I'm using this node context in my block, I'm going to have a method available to me that enables me to get at the node that's being displayed. Those of you who have built views before know that when you create blocks, blocks can't accept arguments. And when you need to have a block display something from the node that's on the page, what you do in views is you go into the contextual filters, you say add an argument. It's going to be a default argument. We're going to get the content ID from the URL, and now I can get at my node type of stuff when I'm in the block. This context key does that same thing for us here. We now know that this node is being displayed on the page, and I can get at that node. And how I get at it is there's this method that now becomes available to us that's called getContextValue. That happened because of the annotation. That's all. The annotation was at the top of my class, and now I've got this new method called getContextValue, and you'll see the context that I'm getting is node. That context has to match the context that you set up above. Right now there are two contexts that Drupal provides. There's the user context and there's the node context. Okay? I still haven't actually figured out where and how it defines those contexts. I just know what I can do with it when it's there. I think theoretically you can also provide your own context. But until I understand how Drupal provides the user context and the node context, I have no clue how to provide my own context. But this whole context-aware plugin is a super cool thing that Drupal 8 has, and you tap into it by using the annotations. So this provides functionality to my block class just because I put some stuff in the annotations up there. It gets parsed when your file is being read so that it can be compiled. And then stuff happens on the back end as a result of that. Okay, if there's one thing that you're going to take away from sitting through this entire presentation, this is the thing you should take away. We're coming to it right now. If you're tired, if you've been zoning out, wake up, listen up. You need to know this. Dependency injection. This is a major pattern that's used throughout all of Drupal 8. It's changed the way that Drupal is done. Let's look at it. There's 3 different ways that we can do dependency injection. We can do it through a service. We can do it through the container interface, which is things like controllers. Or we can do it through the Container Factory plugin interface, which is things like blocks. And to be honest, there aren't really 3 different ways to do it. There's really 2 different ways to do it. But 3 sounds cooler than 2. And if I was going to be really honest about it, it's the same thing. There's only one thing that you're doing, but there's just a different way that you indicate what happens. So we're going to look at these 3 different ways that you can tell Symfony that you want to be able to do dependency injection. So let me describe what dependency injection is before we look at how you do it. It sounds like a big, technical, complicated word, and when I first heard about it, it was scary to me. It's like, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to learn dependency injection? When you write procedural code, you can write functions. And your functions can take, whether you want to call them arguments or parameters. You pass stuff into that function. That's dependency injection. The only thing that's different about it is that instead of passing in some string or some argument, you're passing in an object. But what you do is you pass the object into another object. So when you're building your object, its constructor method receives these other objects and it can make use of them. You utilize dependency injection because instead of writing all of this code inside of your object, if you just inject the necessary objects into yours, then you just use what they have available to you, and you just get to assume that they work. Dependency injection is super helpful, not just for the ability to do the swapping in and out of different functionality, but also in the ability to now write actual unit tests. Drupal 8 was Drupal was pretty much impossible to unit test prior to Drupal 8 because we didn't have this ability to do dependency injection. And so we had all of the dependencies were written, rolled out in the code inside of your modules. And so when you wanted to test stuff, it became a nightmare to try to be able to break things out. With dependency injection, what you do is you are injecting an object. But the object that you're writing, it's called the system under test, the SUT, you just get to assume that all that stuff that's injected into it works. You only need to test your methods. You only need to test your specific stuff, and you can mock those objects, which, again, is why you use interfaces, because you can, when you're going to inject the thing in there, you can have these mock interfaces that you put in. This is the power of dependency injection. It's separation of concerns, it's testability, it makes life so much better as a web developer. And all it is that instead of hard coding things inside of your particular code that you're writing there, you say, I need this thing. When you build my object, I want you to put this other things inside of my object because I want to use what they do as well. And now you've got it available to you. Let's look at how you get those other things, those other objects inside of your object. So if we're dealing with a service, we define our services in a services.yaml file. I've got my presentation manager service. I've defined it in my services YAML file. And you can see I've got these arguments. My service needed the entity type manager service. That's what the @ sign means there. You could also inject parameters. into your service if you wanted to. I'm injecting the entity type manager object, and I needed the entity type manager object because that's what gives me the ability to get into the database and find out the contents of the nodes. Okay? But that's another service that's available to me. I don't have to write all that logic. Just bring in the entity type manager, and then I've got stuff that I'm able to use inside of my service. That's how you tell Symfony, I want this object injected into my object. And what ends up happening when you do that, when you look inside of your service, inside your class, you've got your constructor function. And so when Symfony is doing basically the new statement on your service, it's going to pass the entity type manager into your constructor, and now that object is available to your object that you're creating. And then what I do is I take it, it's typical, you just put it into a property that you've got in your class, and then you use that property later on. So the object's been injected, and now you've got it available through the property that you place it into, and then you just do stuff using that property. That's how you get at it with services. If you want to get at it with something like a controller, and this is my controller, actually, and my controller needed my presentation manager service because, for instance, it needed to get at the table of contents. My controller extends the controller base, and the controller base already implements the necessary interfaces. So all I need to do in a controller to be able to get objects injected into it is use this create method. And in that create method, that's where you tell Symfony, oh, Symfony, I need you to give me the presentation manager service. And then when Symfony instantiates my object, my class into an object, into the constructor, it's going to pass the presentation manager service. Now, some of you might look at that and say, wait a minute, I thought you just said that with dependency injection, you're not hard coding things. But this is your class that you're writing. And in your class, you're saying, I want this presentation manager service. How is that not hard coding anything? First of all, you have to understand, you've got to tell Symfony what needs to be injected. It can't just magically know. So you need to tell it something that you need, right? So you're telling it that you need a particular service. But notice that what I'm type hinting with is an interface. So any object that implements that interface can be injected into my object. And Drupal provides a way that you can override, say, you know what, when he says he wants this presentation manager service, I really didn't like his service, I've written a different service. Anytime you see that, swap my service for his service. So it's not, it really isn't hard-coded. You have to provide enough information so Symfony has a clue what to do, but you've got the ability to swap out one service for another service. And since we're doing with the interfaces here, everything works out in the end. So it really is, I mean, it's totally swappable. You just need to tie it together in some fashion. And then the third way that we can do this is if we needed to do it in a block. So in my block, in order to be able to do dependency injection, I do actually have to specifically say that I'm implementing the container factory plugin interface. That's how I can now get access. Because I'm implementing a certain interface, I know there's a method that's going to be available to me. And then when I use that method, that's how I tell Symfony to inject the object that I need. And from there, it looks exactly the same as when we did it in the controller. That's why I'm saying these two really are the same thing. It's just that with the controller base, that controller base already implements the necessary interface. So you've got the create method available to you. When you're dealing with the block, you have to specifically say, oh, I want this block to extend the block base, and I want it to implement this container factory plugin interface. And once I've implemented that interface, that's where I now have got this create method available to me, which is the same type of thing, except when you're doing it with the block, you'll notice there's some other stuff that, that Symfony also passes into our create method, just because we're dealing with plugins and you need to know stuff about configuration and all this other stuff, which is not really what we care about in my block. What we care about in my block is that I still need this presentation manager service because that's the block that generates the table of contents. Well, there's also the blocks that generate everything else that are using the services. Here is the example that I was telling you that when you you can actually Our block extends the block base. Our block base has a constructor method in it. Okay? We are taking advantage of where it says parent, that double colon, it's nekuta dai, I forget, it's a Hebrew word. It means like double colon. That's the scope resolution operator. In our constructor method, you can see like pamayim nekuta daim. Yeah, yeah. This is running our parent's constructor first, so we haven't overridden it. We're extending what our parent's constructor does. So we're calling the parent's constructor, and then after that's done, we do our own thing in our constructor as well, and that's where we make use of the presentation manager service that's been injected. So there's an example of, like I was saying, extending a method that you've inherited. You don't have to totally wipe it out. You can still make reference with the scope resolution operator. Okay? All right. Great. Now, I've talked about controllers, and I said that I did need to use routing in my module. This is what routing does. It's one piece of what used to be part of hook menu. Prior to Drupal 8, there were a lot of parts of the system that did a lot of stuff all in one place. And one of the things that was a focus with Drupal 8 is this notion of separation of concerns. Don't try to do everything all in one spot. Put everything in a logical place. Have everything be very focused on what it does, so that you don't have to, you can actually understand that piece of the system. Like you can focus on that and say, oh, I want to know what this does, and I can look just at this. Hook menu does a whole lot more stuff besides just routing. In Drupal 8, they've broken that routing piece out into the routing YAML file. And the only thing that the routing YAML file is responsible for doing is associating a path with something that gets done at that path. And what it looks like is this. So I needed to make a couple of paths available. I've given it a route name. That's the first part of the key. That's the top level key. So one of my routes is named presentation.display_table of TOC. It's associated with the path presentation/table of contents. That was that first page that you saw when you sat down in the classroom here. That was my table of contents page that I put there. It's handled by the controller that's located inside the namespace. This controller's name is display table of contents. The method that it uses to get that render array is build. That's the thing that I put in that trait. So the controller ties all of these things together. You can have forms. You've got other things that will be associated with the path. But that's the routing file right there. It's a YAML file. It's pretty simple to understand when you see it. And if you needed to figure out how to do things, you can always look at other routing files and say, oh, right, I don't quite need to do that, but let me look at other modules and their routing files and let me see how they're doing things so that I can do that same type of a thing. Okay, now is where we get to the things that's sort of not exactly module development and is sort of blurring over into what might be considered more front-end stuff. But I did need to use this in this module, so this isn't just limited to front-end stuff. We're going to talk about these libraries, because I mentioned I've got a libraries YAML file. The reason we've got libraries in Drupal 8 is for asset management and for performance reasons. Instead of loading every single thing on every page, which is what Drupal 7 previously did, jQuery is loaded on every single page. Like everything gets loaded, every CSS file, every JavaScript, like it all gets loaded on every single page, which is not great for performance. What you do with libraries is you package different things up into your different libraries, and then you tell Drupal when to attach that library. So when I'm in this situation, I need this CSS, I need this JavaScript, or I need these JavaScript settings. And so I want this library in this context, and that's the only place that I need it. That's what we do with libraries, is manage our assets and say when we want to get at them. We use the libraries YAML file, and what we put inside the libraries file is as many different libraries as we want. I only needed one library, and all I needed for my library was this little bit of JavaScript that I wrote, which is what's giving the ability, you notice when I had the slides and I click on it, and then the next bullet point comes, and the next bullet point comes, and the next one, so it looks more like a PowerPoint presentation. That's just this tiny bit of JavaScript that's playing games, that all the things are hidden initially, and now when you click, it displays the next one and the next one. Okay, teeny tiny bit of JavaScript. But that's also using the jQuery library, and there's other stuff. And so even though you might say, what's the big deal if your JavaScript got loaded to every page? It's not that much. Well, first of all, it doesn't apply to every page. In my presentation, it does, because every page that we look at happens to be a slide. But that wouldn't necessarily be the case on every site. So I make sure that I attach my slide library only when it's needed. And so all I'm specifying is the JavaScript that I want. But again, you could say there's CSS that you want in certain situations, and there's JavaScript settings that you want in certain situations. Put it into a library, attach the library when you need it, and then you've got it when you need it. It's not there when you don't need it. We're going to look at how I use that in a moment, but before we get to that, we need to talk about hooks, because not everything is object-oriented in Drupal 8. There still is some procedural code, and the reason there's still some procedural code in Drupal 8 is that they haven't converted all of the hooks into this system where you use like events and dispatchers and subscribers and listeners. Okay, this is the object-oriented way that you do things, but not all of Drupal 8, Drupal's hooks have been converted in Drupal 8 to this whole event dispatcher type system. And your hooks go in your .module file. And I did need to make use of a hook because I needed to tell Drupal a template suggestion that I wanted to use. And while with themes, you just put your template suggestion into your themes templates and Drupal sees it and picks it up, with modules that's not the case. When you're writing a module and you want a template to be picked up, you need to use hook theme and say, this is the template suggestion that I want. And the template suggestion that I wanted was this node slide full template. And you're going to see why I needed that template in a moment, and you're also going to see how I knew that I wanted to name my template node slide full. So this is what I needed in my .module file, was this one hook, this hook theme. So we talked about template files just now. The templating system that's being used in Drupal 8 is Twig. We're not using PHP template anymore. You can use it if you want to still. But Twig is very similar to our PHP template with the tpl.php files, although it's easier to use. You still can have your template suggestions just like you could before. I'm using the template suggestion there. And it's even easier to figure out what template you want to use, because Twig provides this debugging ability where they're going to put HTML comments in your page source, and so you can actually figure out where something is coming from. Instead of like prior to Drupal 8, you look at a page and you're like, how is this happening? Like, what is going on? And now you got to dig around, and you try to get into the template, and you're like, oh, they've got this template that's doing that. Now I see why this was happening on the page. But it could have taken you, not joking, hours till you figured that out, till you dug into the right place and finally got at it. Things are better with Twig. Here's the template that I used, this node slide full. It's a Twig template. It's overriding your standard node template. And the only reason I needed it is that I wanted to use this attach library function. When I'm looking at the full node view of one of my slides, put this library on here so that I can click my bulleted lists and they'll display one by one. That's why I needed the template. That's how I attached the library in this situation. You can attach libraries in other ways as well in Drupal, but it's the exact same concept. You attach a library in the context that it's needed. Okay, so how did I know what template suggestion to use? So I went into this is my application services.yaml file. When you define your own service, you've got your module name .services.yaml. This is the Drupal instance Y services YAML file. This is the place where you can go to, as I mentioned earlier, if you didn't like my presentation manager service and you wanted to write your own service, you would go into the services YAML file, and this is a way that you can let Drupal know, use this service instead of that service wherever you see it. I didn't need the services YAML file for that, though. What I use the services YAML file for, bless you, was to tell Drupal, turn on Twig debugging. And once you turn on Twig debugging, that's where you get these comments, these HTML comments, that tell you what's going on with the templates. And what they look like is this. And there's lots of templates. There are still lots of templates used in Drupal 8. So it's very helpful to look at these comments, and as you go down the page, you can say, oh, I'm in this situation, and here's the various templates. I could have used Node HTML, which is what the default is. And then there are these various suggestions. And what you can see right now is the X is the one that's being used right now. In this spot, this template is being used. And I'll get this wrapped up here quickly, but if you wanted to stick around for a minute afterwards, I've actually still got that running right now. It tells you further. I've kind of got that grayed out. It tells you specifically what template. It tells you what directory it's under. Like, not only is that the name of the template, but here's where you can go if you want to find that template. So that's what the Twig debugging provides you. That takes us all the way through the presentation. I did it. I guess I ran 1 minute over. If you want to ask questions, I'm happy to entertain questions now. We're going to be heading into lunch, so we actually have some time. You can catch me at lunch. Come sit at the table, talk to me. Or if you were paying attention in the beginning, you know where you can reach me online. Go into the Git repos that I provided. You can file an issue against the presentation module. You can file an issue against this presentation itself. You can get to me through my contact form. I love talking about this stuff. I hope you enjoy the presentation. I hope it gets you excited about using Drupal 8. If you wanted to ask any questions now, go ahead, fire away. I'll stick around and I'll answer them. Yes?
On this note, there's one more session before lunch.
Oh, okay. So I actually can't say it right. So we would have a few minutes before the other one would start, but otherwise I will say thank you so much for attending. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you loved Drupal 8.